Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Alicia Gavidan, and I am an adult services librarian with Vaughan Public Libraries. Before we begin the formal program, I would like to share a few housekeeping notes. To minimize interruptions, participants will be set to mute and videos will be turned off. For accessibility, we have turned on the live transcript feature. A question and answer period will follow the lecture. Questions and comments can be submitted anytime during the lecture via the chat function and are moderated by the co-hosts. Tonight's lecture is being recorded and will be made available on VPL's YouTube channel. I'll now pass it over to Margie Singleton to introduce tonight's lecture and our speakers. Margie.
Thank you, Alicia. So good evening, everyone. As Alicia said, my name is Margie Singleton, and I'm the CEO of Vaughan Public Libraries. So I'd like to welcome you to the final installment in our lecture series, reflecting on racism and discrimination. On behalf of Vaughan Public Libraries, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge that our libraries were built on the territory and treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations per the Toronto Purchase Agreement, also known as Treaty 13. We also recognize that we're situated in the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee, who occupied this land before the arrival of the European settlers. The city of Vaughan is currently home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We acknowledge their contribution to the life and prosperity of this land. As representatives of the people of Vaughan, we are grateful to have the opportunity to work and live in this territory. So as this amazing lecture series draws to a close, I would like to thank the Vice Chair of the Vaughan Public Library Board, Gary Thompson, whose commitment to a better and fairer society resulted in the thought-provoking conversations, insights, and moments of inspiration that have characterized these sessions. I also want to thank the staff and the speakers who brought this series to life. You have our sincerest gratitude for your outstanding efforts. We've covered a vast range of topics in the series that have showcased the Black experience and provided everyone with the tools that they need to effect change in our community. And we'll keep that going in our last lecture this evening. So tonight, we are honored to welcome two guests. We have Neena Gupta, who is a partner at Gowling WLG, where she has a broad employment and human rights practice. She is also co-chair of the firm's Diversity and Inclusion Council. Joining her is Dr. Rebecca Bromwich, Gowling WLG's National Manager of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. Rebecca is passionate about EDI, and through her professional, academic, and personal endeavors, she has always been committed to her vision of an inclusive, collegial, and diverse legal profession and culture. Tonight, our guest speakers will explore the topic of allyship and acts of solidarity. Please join me in giving Neena and Rebecca a very warm welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you very much. I want to give a particular thank you to Gary Thompson for inviting Rebecca and I to come and speak towards allyship. You know, it's very odd doing this even after a year and a half of the pandemic in a Zoom setting. I personally like to have these conversations in boardrooms and coffee rooms and hallways and staircases where I find there's lots of creativity, but needs must. Perhaps next year or the year after, we'll be able to meet in person. In order to replicate the buzz of a live event, I really want you to use the chat feature. Feel free to disagree, agree, put in your comments, suggestions. We're going to talk a little bit about resources, tips, and if you've got ideas or resources, I strongly encourage you to use the chat feature so that we can all share from your knowledge and benefit as well. I'm doing this with my colleague, Rebecca Bromwich, who has been an invaluable resource to the firm. And we've often had conversations about equity, diversity, and inclusion, and how each of us can be an ally. But before we get on much further, I think it's actually worthwhile talking a little bit about what we mean by equity, diversity, and inclusion. Now, I'm going to turn this over to Rebecca to deal with, because as a professor of law, she's really had to grapple with this both academically and then practically at our law firm. Rebecca?
Great. Well, thanks so much, Neena. It's my absolute pleasure to be here. Obviously, when we're talking about diversity, I have noticed I'm white, as will others, inevitably. And it's important to think about the intersecting and interlocking dimensions of how we are all different from one another. And so race is one dimension of that. Equity is a substantive legal entitlement or a movement towards being treated fairly. So equity is a kind of fairness, but there's an old saying that the rich and the poor are equally free to sleep under bridges. And so equality in a formal kind of 18th century sense is actually meaningless if we want to be fair to people. So equity is about what is called under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms under Section 15, substantive equality, treating people equally in a way that enables them to have barriers removed so that the playing field can actually be leveled. Inclusion is a verb. It's how we treat people, how we bring our communities and groups together so that people are genuinely made to feel part of it. And it's the antithesis, of course, of exclusion, where people are ostracized and not made to feel part fully of a community that they belong to. So inclusion is a verb. It is an act that brings together and synthesizes equity, which is that fairness of treatment, and diversity, which is a fact. It is a fact that we are different from one another. It is also a fact that we have a kind of humanity that unites us in a fundamental sameness. But we're different in a lot of different ways. We're different in terms of race, gender, sexual orientation, our disability, our age, our socioeconomic status. One of the ways that you can think about libraries specifically, and I know my first job was a library. I was 14 years old. I got paid $4 an hour at the Calgary Public Library. They called me a page. And it was really fundamentally important. Libraries were important to me in terms of the ways that EDI applied to me as somebody who comes from a large family and a modest income level from a socioeconomic status perspective. And so going to the library every week with my mother when I was a child enabled me to have access to resources and education that I would not otherwise have had access to. And so diversity is multi-stranded, multi-dimensional, but it's important we start with an understanding of the terms we're talking about. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. Neena, I don't know if I should flip it over to you.
Sure. So this whole lecture series is really about change. And I think there's a couple of quotes that Rebecca and I really like. You've already heard my Lao Tzu quote. This is another one that I think we both are passionate about. It's, we see a lot of people doing mission statements and to a certain extent, and I don't mean to be critical, it's been trendy to be, talk about equity, but there is a lot of hard work, and it is our hard work. In other words, it's not somebody else's hard work. We each have a role to do this hard work, and we're accountable for it. So I love this quote from Stanley, which is, working to change a diversity culture is not something that is achieved by a single individual or by proclaiming goals on a mission statement. And, full disclosure, Gowling WLG includes diversity and equity and inclusion in its mission statement, but that's just a piece of paper. It isn't real unless we all actually take accountability for it. So this whole session is about techniques and tips about how we can move from what I would call formalistic proclamations of ideals regarding what is diversity and inclusion in our society, and moving to how can we actually achieve it? What can we do individually? What can we do as small groups? And how do we move the needle so that we are achieving a diversity culture? Next slide. So one of the things, Rebecca and I, we've talked about this a lot internally at Gowlings about how we can try to get people involved. And there's a danger that perhaps someone like myself, and I come from a South Asian background, I'm a second generation immigrant. I have been very fortunate that I had parental support all through my education and post-secondary education. And, you know, when I chose to become a lawyer, that was a very unusual choice in the South Asian community, and I always had parental support. And I've often been asked to speak about the South Asian experience as an immigrant, but of course, my experience is vastly different than someone else who may have come from a different community that didn't prize education as much, didn't believe in female education as much, were first generation, weren't as economically advantaged. And so we can't always speak to a certain kind of disadvantage or the needs of a certain kind of equity group, but what we can be is allies. And I'm requesting that the people who are here is to sort of think about what can we do even when we don't necessarily have direct knowledge of the experience or needs of an equity seeking group. And I have had conversations with some of the most privileged or seemingly privileged white men in my life, many of whom were my mentors and allies, who pointed out that even if we think that somebody belongs to an advantaged community, they can quickly become part of an equity-seeking community. A single person who becomes a parent and a single mother or a single father, or a healthy person who unexpectedly becomes ill or suffers a serious accident and then becomes disabled and needs significantly more support than they may have just a few months ago. And so there's a little bit of learning that equity seeking people, and I put myself in that group, have to be that not everybody you think that is advantaged or has it all actually has it all. That in fact, all of us at some point in time will need equity in the sense as Rebecca was talking about, and all of us really need to be allies of each other in that journey. So that's what this session is about. Rebecca?
Great, yeah, and I think it's you know, theorists would say identity is complicated and tricky. When you think of all the different strands of our identities and all the different ways that we are privileged and also marginalized, it's always complicated and it isn't necessarily obvious. And one of the things that we can do to be allies, actually, and I'm foreshadowing some of the things we'll come to, is to not make too many assumptions about each other and start with an open mind. Going to the next slide. This is, go ahead, Neena.
No, it's you. This is really your,
Okay.
you are passionate about. This is what you talk about all the time.
Okay, well, it really is, as Neena said, there's all these intersecting dimensions to the ways that we are diverse and the ways that we are positioned and situated in a social system, in our social location, and our social location has many dimensions. You know, there's a new Matrix movie coming out. So when I used to refer to the Matrix, it made me feel old, but there is a Matrix Resurrections movie. So if anybody's a Matrix fan, or if you're not, you should be, in my humble opinion. But really, the Matrix is about how we're all positioned. And we are all positioned in a social matrix. We are all positioned in a way where we have relative advantage and disadvantage in a whole bunch of different ways. We may or may not, for example, Neena talked about having parental support through her law school years. I mean, and that's the, you know, an important feature of a person's experience. Having a particular marriage or partnership, having a language, multiple languages, or having certain accent. People may treat you differently. And Neena mentioned being first or second generation immigrant. And again, myself being, you know, of settler heritage in Western Canada, having, you know, a long-standing time period for a white person in Canada. So those relative ways that we might be privileged or marginalized in relation to one another. So race is a piece of it, but there is this large puzzle of these interlocking and intersecting dimensions of our identity, and they're not simply additive. So Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality, and it's really about how when you put those pieces together, it's not just like a 1 + 1 thing. And so our identities are complicated and tricky. And when we're looking at equity, diversity, and inclusion, we need to think about a whole bunch of different things. Neena?
So one of the things that I want to sort of comment on, and it's something that's a little delicate. If you could just flip up to that the like blobs that we had in the previous
sure.
is class. We don't like talking about class in North America. And yet class is one of those things that really makes a difference. And we talk about it a little bit later, but money and economic certainty really are huge. And some of the most disadvantaged people we see in our lives are people who do not have economic resources. And when you combine that with recent immigrant status, BIPOC status, LGBTQ status, those class becomes really, like, if you peel everything away, class essentially can help cover or make up for some of the other disadvantages. We don't like talking about class, but it is really important. So as you're thinking about allyship and the Human Rights Code, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Rebecca, we know this as lawyers, really doesn't address the issue of class at all. And yet, to me, when I look at my own journey and what advantaged me, is that although my parents came to Canada as new immigrants with very few resources, they had education, that blob on the right. And because of that education, they were able to get solidly into the middle class, which meant that I never had to worry, and quite frankly, they never had to worry about food, a roof over their head, where their next paycheck was coming from, and that they could give me, their child, a certain lifestyle and security, which of course meant for an attitude towards the world, and also a sense of well-being in this community, that I belonged here, that I had these resources. We don't like to talk about that, but it's very true in this country, as in every other country, that economic resources is a huge issue. The other thing that we don't talk about, and I don't want to, we're talking about allyship, but I've been thinking a lot about age as I creep up there, Rebecca. And we saw something really horrible happen in the pandemic. And what we saw was the long-term care homes were left to fend for themselves at the beginning, and the health system made a decision to protect the hospitals. And it was mostly old and disabled people in the long-term care setting. And it was the rest of us who, if we had an accident or illness, who would access the hospitals. I wonder if the same decision would have been made if most of the people in those long-term care homes weren't as old as they were and past their, quote, economic fruitful lives. And I wonder how much age discrimination had to do with it. So I'm inviting people, when we think of allyship, of course we should be addressing things like Black Lives Matter and Every Child Matters. But there are other issues that don't directly seem to actually fall into this whole area of allyship and equity that have profound connections, at least for me, to the issue of equity. And age is one of how we treat our old people in this community and in our healthcare system is definitely one of those issues. Next slide. So I want to talk about privilege, and I wanted to address it head on. And I wanted to do it because privilege is bandied about, and it's often used in a politically fraught way, sometimes in an accusatory way, sometimes in a way to discredit others. And I wanted to sort of admit that as a lawyer, I have a lot of privilege, and some of that's actually earned, because I worked hard to be a lawyer and to be here, and especially in a time when that wasn't the typical career path for a person of color. But it also gives me a lot of unearned advantages or unearned credibility. Because I'm a lawyer, people think I know what I'm talking about. Now, Rebecca, I do know about some things. I promise you, I actually am a good lawyer in certain areas, but people just assume that you can speak with credibility about other issues, about which, quite frankly, I may know less than the vast majority of the population, but because I'm a lawyer or it's a, other credentialed person, I have that unearned credibility. And so what I like to think about as privilege is not something to bong over your head and say, well, you're privileged, so I'm going to discredit you, is to ask you to understand that all of us have some privilege, some way more than others, rich people way more than poor people, educated people more than less educated people, but it's a form of unearned advantage. It's stereotypical assumptions that work in your favor. And so I'm not going to, if you're a very privileged person in the, political analysis of 2021, that's great. I'm delighted for you. I'm not jealous of you. I just want you to use that privilege to be a great ally. So it's what you do with your privilege that really matters.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that with respect to privilege, the idea of Bell Hooks has this really great book called Class Matters, when she talks about socioeconomic status as well. So if speaking of being libraries, there's a book to look at. But one of the things too about privilege that she talks about is it's not that useful for people who have privileged positions to feel particularly guilty about it. So if you have privilege, guilt isn't that helpful. Guilt isn't that useful. It just means there's work to be done. Privilege is a little bit like it's energy, it's an opportunity, it's an ability. So if you become cognizant of it and you can use it, as Neena says, to benefit people, then that's what you can do with it. But it's not so much about feeling guilty, but about doing work. So moving on.
So, Rebecca, I know we hear this, especially as lawyers, a lot. Well, you've got privilege. And I want to, it's true, you might have privilege. And particularly if you're a white person in North America, you are privileged in some ways. But I don't want to take away from the fact that you probably worked really hard to get where you are. And more importantly, your parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents, they probably worked really hard too to give you the lifestyle you now enjoy. And many white people, let's be honest, face enormous challenges in their lives, and they need help. And so another way of looking at privilege, Rebecca, for me, is that in some dimensions of your life is easier or simpler than others. And I'm not trying to put any kind of political content on it, no kind of moral judgment on it. It's just a statement of fact. And I have to tell you, Rebecca, I have found the last 2 weeks really hard. The Kyle Rittenhouse trial, which I've tried to avoid, I'm ashamed to admit, because I couldn't do it. I couldn't watch a trial where somebody brought a lethal weapon and was brandishing it about and then gets away with using self-defense. Now, I realize that's America and they have a very interesting gun culture that if we start talking about, we will never finish but I don't believe that if a Black 17-year-old went into a white demonstration with a machine gun and shot 3 white people, that he would have been acquitted by a jury. I just don't believe that. And so that's a form of privilege. And Kyle Rittenhouse is now being offered jobs as a congressional aide, and people are fighting over him. And I'm thinking, okay, so maybe he wasn't guilty, but do you really want somebody like that who showed that poor judgment? Is that the criteria to hire a congressional intern, page, or aide? And so it's all about white privilege in that case.
And this is where, again, a library piece, a book recommendation, Sheryl Sandberg's book, Lean In. She talked about women and how we should conduct ourselves a certain way. And then her husband died. And she became aware of the privilege she had had as someone who was partnered. So she's a white woman. She's the chief operating officer of what was then Facebook, which is now called Meta. But she became aware of a privilege she was previously unaware of, which is having a supportive partner in her life. And so there's an example of, she wrote a second book after that, privilege makes your life easier in certain ways, and relative lack of privilege makes your life harder. And I too have been upset by the Rittenhouse verdict, and I think it's appalling. So I think that was really useful to mention that.
Yeah, I just couldn't do it. Like, yeah. So yeah, this sort of helps you think about privilege, Rebecca. This is, I think, some of the ways people, can think about privilege. And Rebecca, I think this is your list.
Okay. So class privilege, Neena's been talking a lot about class, and I think it's really important to think about it. There is saying, follow the money, right? You want to know what's going on in a situation, follow the money. So if you're middle class, you don't have to worry about where your next meal's coming from. You don't have to worry about how your rent's going to get paid or how your mortgage is going to get paid. You probably don't have to worry, depending on what strata in the middle class you are, you have to worry less about your retirement. You have to worry less about your children's education, things like that. If you're male, you're less likely to be subject to sexual assault or unwanted advances. Although what we've seen with respect to Chicago Blackhawks in the NHL, no one is immune from unwanted sexual advances. But these are all about relative likelihoods. If you're cisgender, you're not questioned about what bathroom you use. If you're white, you don't get asked, where do you come from? Where do you really come from? No, really, where do you come from? As a Canadian, I am also, my ancestors not long ago were also from somewhere else, but nobody asks me where I come from, which is, it's interesting. I walk into a room and nobody says, hey, where are you really from? But I hear it. I hear that all the time. If you have an accent, if you speak what is perceived as North American English, you don't get asked about where you come from. And that question of where you come from, it might sound like a friendly question, but really it's undermining a sense that a person belongs where they are. It's exclusionary. It's excluding them. If you're an older or younger worker, you can be subject to stereotypes. It's interesting because this is like double-edged and intersecting, because as a woman, if you're younger, you can lack credibility, but if you're older, you can lack visibility, right? And so I read a joke that like a woman has about 3 minutes when she's 42 that people notice that she's there and she's credible to do a job, and then the 3 minutes pass, right? Age applies to men as well, and immigration status. There may be legal dimensions to the limitations on your ability to work or travel.
Yeah, and it is it's scary sometimes, right? About kind of the immigration start. It's also, your credentials may not be recognized. And many of the people, who are in this audience may know somebody who's been trained in a different country who actually knows how to do the job, but the trade college or the legal in college or the College of Physicians and College of Physicians and Surgeons won't recognize it. And so they have to take a job that is a survival job or a job that doesn't actually leverage all that skills. So I'm going to let you do this one. Just a 30-second warning. I'm having a one of those dreaded low internet bandwidths. So I'm going to ask you to take the next couple of slides while I fix that.
Okay, no problem. So inclusion starts with I. And so what that's about is that all of us are part of the diversity and equity inclusion puzzle. We're all pieces of that. And so it's all about the ways in which we diverge from each other. We all belong. So a quote again, with respect to allyship. Always wondered why someone doesn't do something about that. And then I realized I am someone, right? So sometimes we can think about ourselves as lacking in power. Anybody who, I'm an academic, so I'm thinking about it, anybody who studies Foucault out there, if you don't, you just ignore me for a minute. But the idea that power is generative and comes from below, and that in fact, when we interact with one another, there's power in those interactions. In those little tiny micro processes, these little ways we interact every day, who we choose to smile at, who we choose not to smile at, if we become more mindful of that. One thing that I hear from people who are Black, people who are African Canadian, is that sometimes people are more likely to grab their purses or look suspicious or lock their car doors when they're around them. That sense of those are microaggressions, micro processes where there's an immediate distrust. And so it's important to think mindfully about the way that we're interacting and realizing that we actually each have the power to effect some level of change in little tiny moments. I mean, sometimes we think about making decisions about equity, diversity, and inclusion as though we're going to have a dramatic moment. There's going to be, for example, the Chauvin trial, where Derek Chauvin was convicted. The jurors in that trial had a moment where they had an opportunity to affect change in a dramatic way in the American justice system, and they convicted him. And it was a really important moment. Most of us are not going to be jurors on a trial like that. But every day we have opportunities to act in ways that are going to either serve and promote equity, diversity, and inclusion or not. And so to just take hold of that and be aware that we don't have to be in any position of authority formally to have an important impact. And Barack Obama, who I love still, said still always have, as soon as they learned about him. But he said when he stopped being president, he said, I will go back to being the most important thing, which is a citizen. And it's problematic to maybe use the word citizen from an immigration perspective, but that as a person, as a human being in an interaction, we all have some level of power, even if we have different levels of relative privilege. Neena, did you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, Rebecca, I'm a fan of Barack Obama as well, and suffer through the prior presidency thinking, like, was that all, which one was the bad dream type of thing? But the I am someone, there's a wonderful, for those of you who come from the Indian community, you will know who I'm referring to, but there is a poet by the name of Rabindranath Tagore, and he was the first South Asian to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. And he has this wonderful poem, and it says, if no one heeds your call, start walking on the path alone. In other words, sometimes you may be that's, you know what's the right thing to do, but no one else wants to do it. Well, sometimes somebody's got to start, and it's going to be you. So that's part of the allyship journey. So Tagore and Gandhi were sort of like the intellectual moral center of India's independence movement in the pre-World War II and World War II eras. And there's that wonderful poem, it is one that has resonated all my life. And it was one of my mom and dad's favorite because they grew up through that era. So we want to talk about allyship a little bit more. And Rebecca, if you wanted to just take the slide to the next slide. There you go. So there's lots of definitions of allyship out there, but Rebecca and I really like this. And this is the individual or collective decision to support, that's an important word, support people in their quest for inclusion, even though you don't necessarily have something directly implicated or something to gain from that quest. Or to quote someone, my husband, you don't have a dog in the fight, but you still decide that it's important to support that quest for inclusion. It's men who have supported women. And I think Rebecca and I have previously both spoken of male allies and male mentors who have been critical to our career success. White people who have supported the BIPOC community, settlers who have supported Indigenous communities, the rich who have chosen to support the impoverished, and established communities who choose to support new immigrants and refugees who are starting out. They are essentially making an individual or collective decision to support people in their quest for inclusion. I want to talk a little bit about my in-laws. As some of you know, that I married into as white a family as you can. So when I got married, it was not hard to know whose side of the family was the groom's side of the family. Those were the blonde, blue-eyed people. Norwegian and Danes, all of them, some second and third generation. And who was on my side? They were the brown-eyed, dark brown, light brown people with black hair. And I had never known any of my grandparents. So on my wedding, I remember telling my grandmother-in-law that it was the first time I had actually had a grandmother in my family. And she was, somebody who had grade 4 education, had to leave school to support her family in the Depression, really tough life. I got to learn about how included I felt in that family. And I realized it was because of her. She made sure that anybody who came through her doors was always part of the family. She saved her money to support Vietnamese, she called them boat people, and supported a whole family from her very meager resources. Welcomed them in the middle of the prairie winter, which I'm sure was a culture shock, and really lived that spirit of inclusion. Now, she would have called it her Christian duty. She wouldn't have used the words inclusion. But when I look at that family and how welcomed I've always felt with my in-laws, it is really that spirit of caritas, as she would call it, that you love every person, whoever they are, because they are each God's children. Now, we may use it in a secular way, and talk about it, but this idea isn't new. This idea of being allyship, it percolates all through history. It comes up in different words and in different manifestations, but it's there because I think there's always been a desire, when you've seen people being treated unfairly, to do something to help them. So that is what allyship is. Now, what we're going to talk about is how to be an effective ally.
And we all have experiences with allyship. Certainly, one of my experiences is I spent time in the children's aid system as a teenager, and I had a lot of strong mentorship and help from various people in the education system, various people who are more economically privileged than I was, various people who had different kind of level of support. And I can certainly speak to what Neena's saying about it. Some of them were men, some of them were women. Some of them had more privilege than me in a variety of different ways. Some of them were people of color. And we all exist in a community and in a web of relationships. There is a kind of modernist idea that, you're born alone, you die alone. I've given birth to 4 children. They weren't born alone. I was there, right? That's not how it works. And so allyship is really about understanding that we exist together in a community. So there are some things, though, that we should talk about with respect to allyship. What isn't, what we're not looking for. So even though there's a history of allyship with respect to the Christian church and with respect to the wealthy and those who are less wealthy in our society, there are ways that we don't recommend seeking to be allies. And one is through performative allyship. That's extremely popular right now. It involves a lot of hashtags and poses. The idea that it can be trendy or politically correct. It's cool. If you go on TikTok, you're going to see a lot of this. Sorry, teenagers, not to discriminate against you. There's a lot of great ideas out there, particularly on the part of my kids. But there really are. It's really problematic to just sign up to something. If you think that if you like something on Facebook, or if you heart it on Instagram, or whatever you do on those other platforms like Snapchat, that's not really allyship. We're not talking about bumper stickers or Facebook profile pictures here. We're actually talking about something deeper than that. And so allyship involves actually putting things on the line and thinking a little bit more mindfully and deeply. Also, taking up the space for other people is not allyship. So saying, for example, as I mentioned, I'm a white person, I know it, we can all see it. But if we're going to talk about racism, and I'm going to sit here by myself and talk about racism, where there are perfectly capable people of color who can talk about it, it's not appropriate for me to be the only person talking about that. And so it's important to step aside when necessary and not drown out other voices. And also, assuming is a problem. So we have to make fewer assumptions about one another. We have to ask more questions. And so just because we've had one experience of oppression or one experience of a relative lack of privilege doesn't mean that we understand completely the experience of other people's, and that those, even if someone is embodied in a very similar way to us, their life experience, their mental health, their history is not necessarily going to be the same as ours. So we need to have, a growth mindset and what they used to call teachable hearts when we are thinking about allyship. Neena?
Sorry, if you could go to the next slide. So we're going to start on this journey of allyship, and we're going to start with learning. And it's Since we're at a library, I'm going to start with the most obvious one, is read books written from a different perspective and consider history from a different perspective. As a member of the settler community, you know, I think that one of the most moving things that I saw was the trial of Louis Riel. I grew up in Regina, so this was something that you did as part of your education. And I realized halfway through that I wouldn't have convicted Louis Riel, that he had every right to fight for his people. His people were being killed and he stood up to them and did the right thing. But I did not know about the Métis people. So I saw that trial from a different perspective. And that was sort of maybe the seeds of this journey. We're talking about a 50-year journey. Maybe that's where the journey started. But reading books written from a different perspective. If you're a woman, from a man's perspective. If you're Black, perhaps, you know, reading from a South Asian perspective or Indigenous perspective is really important. If you're, you know, reading from, you know, I've read books about, you know, the Irish potato famine and the, you know, when no Irish and no dogs, you know, the oppression that they faced. I've read about what the Catholic Church did to young Irish people in their, you know, boarding schools and residential schools and orphanages. So learning about history from a different perspective, learning about people from a different perspective is really important. So shout out to the Vaughan Public Libraries, because I have no doubt that you have a rich set of resources. We also have a bibliography at the end of this. And it doesn't have to always be dry history books. I actually think fiction is an act of liberation, because some of the best fiction can actually cause you to think, because we love stories, right? So what's fiction? Fiction is a great story. So, you know, one of my favorite books is Lawrence Hill's The Book of Negro. So, you know, just it's Amanita. You know, when you say which fictional character do you want to meet? I want to meet Amanita. I want to know how she survived. I want to meet her. So she is my literary hero. But it just really makes you think differently about slavery and its impact on North America. The other thing is learn about unconscious bias. So I'm going to tell you a really fun story. So I'm sitting with, I'm an only child, and this is important. I was precocious, and my parents lived with a whole bunch of, you know, in an academic world, and they invited their academics, and they never thought it was necessary to dumb down the discussion. So the attitude was like, if you can't follow the discussion, too bad, so sad. So I'm listening to these very smart, mostly brown people of South Asian origin, all of whom have multiple degrees, really sort of lambaste the institutional racism they are facing in their various careers. Okay, so that's an interesting discussion. Move on, 2 courses in the meal later, they start saying really nasty things about Black people and about Indigenous people. And I'm mentally thinking, and I can't have been more than 10 or 11 years old. I haven't said a word because, of course, I didn't have their vocabulary, thinking, well, if it's unfair for people to judge you because your skin is brown, isn't it unfair for us to judge Blacks and Indigenous people? We didn't call them Indigenous then, by the way, we call them Natives. So let's be honest about that, because they come from a different community. And it was the first inkling that I had about unconscious bias. And I heard from my parents' friends that it was impossible for a brown person to be biased or racist because they had faced so much racism. I swear to God, this is true. This is absolutely true. It was impossible. And I'm mentally thinking, but that's not true. I just heard you say racist things. Now, I was also brought up to be a very good South Asian, you know, girl. So I would never contradict my family members in public because that was an absolute no-no. But I think it was, for me, I've understood right from a very early age that we all have our biases and our blind spots. And the only way you can, just like if you have a muscle weakness, you need to work out. Unconscious bias, you need to work out on that end too. The other thing it's important is to listen to voices you disagree with and understand where they're coming from, even if you don't agree with them. And I do this as a lawyer, because as a lawyer, I want to know where the opposition is and where they're coming from, even if I don't understand. I want to know the case I have to meet. But I think in a society, we need to do this for a different reason. And the reason we need to do it is we need to listen because we need to understand where the opposition is coming from. And it's usually from a point of fear and anxiety. And how do we meet that fear and anxiety in a way that allows people to see that we can be allies rather than enemies? So listening is really important. You know, the old adage, we have one mouth and two ears. God gave us 2 ears for a reason. You have to listen twice as more than you have to speak. Something I have a problem with, as you know, Rebecca. Next slide.
One of the things that we can benefit from, and Brené Brown, there's another book referral, Brené Brown's books, you know, the idea of being vulnerable, allowing ourselves to be imperfect, acknowledge that we all have biases. So I grew up, as I said, in Western Canada. I grew up in Alberta. We did not call Indigenous people Indigenous people. I grew up in a community that was horribly discriminatory against Indigenous people, and it's appalling for me to think about it now. And I want to acknowledge that. I want to own that reality. And to admit that we have not acted perfectly in our pasts, and that as Canadians in 2021, I think we all have to realize that and admit that and go from there. We are always, Judith Butler, there's another writer to recommend. I'm throwing out these, I'm assuming as a library audience wanted to hear about writers and readers, but we're always already interrupted by the past. And to acknowledge and own it, and we can be strong enough and vulnerable enough and brave enough to admit that wrongs have happened in the past, that we've been complicit in them, even if we haven't actively participated in them. And I think as Canadians, settler people, we all have to acknowledge that. The residential schools were in operation when I was a student, up until the 1990s, the mid 1990s. When I was in school, my entire school career, I graduated in 1994, there were residential schools operating near me with Indigenous children in them. So we have to be aware of that, admit our imperfections, admit when we don't know, say, well, what do you mean by that? You know, help me understand. But also don't expect people who are less privileged to do all the work for us, right? To leverage our privilege. So true allyship means that if I, for whatever reason, as a white person in a room, that there's some likelihood somebody might listen to me, I might say, hey, you know, hi everybody, I'd like you to meet this person. Here's an opportunity to amplify their voice, to give them an opportunity to speak. Or you could say, I used to think that way, but I've learned. I used to be very uncomfortable with this fact, but now I've understood it. I wasn't sure about this, but I found it really interesting. One place, and you're thinking about a journey I've made intellectually and socially. I grew up in a very religious upbringing, and with respect to LGBTQ plus marriage and partnerships, that was a journey I had to go on at a young age. When I was in law school, I really had a sort of a change of mind about what that was about, and to support the LGBTQ plus community. And I became, you know, supportive and outspoken about that at a time when in Alberta it wasn't really cool. And I think that it's important to let people know we're also on journeys, right? There's a lot of posturing that happens in performative allyship about how we are the purest and most, you know, most woke, the widest awake, right? That isn't very constructive. It's great to be woke. It's great to, you know, take I think it's the blue pill in the Matrix, and to try and figure out what's going on from an equity perspective. But at the same time, it is not an opportunity for us to talk about how we're better than everybody else. Neena, do you want me to flip the slide?
Yeah, please.
Okay.
So I think sometimes we're afraid to be an ally because we're going to make a mistake. We're going to say something wrong. We're going to use the wrong term. We will, in fact, talk over somebody. And I really urge you that perfection is the enemy of the good. Perfection is the enemy of getting things done. If we wait until you are perfect or I am perfect, it isn't going to get done, because I now realize I am not going to be perfect. And so I am going to make mistakes, and that's okay. And so I think sometimes we just have to accept that we're going to make mistakes, and we're just going to, pick ourselves up and keep going. It's interesting how we think about intellectual journeys versus athletic journeys. There isn't a single brilliant gold medal world Olympic champion who hasn't had a bad day, hasn't made a spectacular mistake. I love watching figure skating. We've seen our favorite athletes who are brilliant fall flat on what and pick themselves up. But when we talk about allyship or anything intellectual, it's like we have to be perfect. And if we're not perfect, we all jump on each other. We're not going to jump on each other. We're going to make mistakes. And when we make mistakes, we are going to be gentle with each other. We sometimes have to accept that people will make unfair assumptions. They will assume that you have a wrong motive, or they will assume that you don't know about stuff. I've had people assume that I'm not interested in equity and diversity because I'm an equity partner in a large Canadian law firm. We are the Canadian establishment, et cetera, et cetera. That's not a fair assumption. You don't know me. You're making that assumption because of my economic status as a partner in a firm. But you know what? I can't essentially get too fussed about it. We'll just move on. I also accept that allyship is a journey. And I think this is something I've really learned, Rebecca, in the last, I would say, 5 years, as we've been working together on this, equity and diversity journey at Gowlings. It seems sometimes that, we make a few strides, and there's just so much more to do, and we'll never get it done. But, again, that's not an excuse for not going forward. That's not an excuse for taking the next steps on that 1,000-mile journey. It's okay to say, maybe I'm going to help move the needle. I'm going to this far, or I'm going to help on this part of the journey. And the next generation or other resources or other people are going to have to take it the next, because I don't have those skill set. And then the other thing I say is sometimes you have to work out. I've been taking far more training courses on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And just like if you want to talk about your fitness journey or you want to talk about your athletic journey, you have to work out. And I think equity, diversity, and inclusion, if we adopted, you talked about that learning mindset. If we adopted that training mindset that great athletes have, we'd be far better off in equity, diversity, and inclusion. And you will be a far better ally, even if you're imperfect, if you keep working out and keep trying. And if you make a mistake, you apologize and you move forward and you learn from it and you do something different.
And on that working out analogy, I recently saw the movie King Richard, which is about the father of Serena and Venus Williams. And it's an amazing movie for many reasons. As Will Smith, from an EDI perspective, is fantastic. But one of the things that's really good about the movie, now he's a controversial guy, their father, but he's a good coach, and he is supportive, and he is kind, and he doesn't stigmatize them when they make mistakes. They just work on it and work on it. And I think that's important from the perspective of us all being on a journey, thinking about call out culture as opposed to call in culture. The idea that sorry, Neena?
Rebecca, you just sort of pushed a button. I hate call out culture. I really do. I think it's like taking cheap shots to make you look good, but it doesn't move the needle. And I think there's a real danger of it backfiring, because if people are feeling, well, if I do anything, I'm just going to be called out, right? Why bother? You're actually, there's a group of people you're never going to convert. You're never going to turn into allies who are never going to be on your side. You just don't worry about them. But there's a mushy middle. And in that mushy middle, there are a lot of people that could be persuaded or made less hostile. Well, I don't know about you, but being called out in public is not the kind of stuff that is going to help. Now, That doesn't mean you let things slide, because I don't think you should be forced to let things slide. I think there's an art between call out culture and saying, I've got a word, I want to talk about something. I think we could have done better on something. And there's an art to that. So sorry, Rebecca, I interrupted, but you pushed a button. You that's one of my buttons. You know that, right? From the
I'm glad you agree with you that we are on the same page about this. The idea that if Richard Williams wasn't a good coach, he might have been standing there on the sidelines yelling at his daughters, telling them if they missed a shot, they were doing a bad job. He never does that. He's a good coach because he's going to talk to them. He's going to work on it with them. He's not letting it go. They're the best players that ever was. They are the best players that ever was, that they ever played tennis. One day there might be better ones, not so far. And one of the things he did is enable them and empowered them to not be pressured too soon. He let them develop. He let them go on their journey. They didn't play juniors for a long time relative to some of their peers like Jennifer Capriati. You guys got to see this movie, okay? But it's important to think about how we can support in an inclusive way one another to do better with respect to equity, diversity, and inclusion. If we are on the same team and we are trying to, as Neena says, move the needle and advance things together, then calling each other out, stigmatizing people on Twitter or wherever else isn't the way to do it most of the time. I can move the slide along.
So, we've talked a lot about being an ally, and certainly we're, Rebecca, you and I as lawyers are often in very privileged circumstances, and these hints may not apply to everybody. But I ask everyone when they're in their workplaces or in, their church communities or working at charity or even with their friends, just look to see who's there and who's not there. And I really want to encourage you to reach out to the other, sort of, if you think about middle school, I had a friend who always make a point of sitting with the new kids because they would feel alone. Shouldn't surprise you that she's gone on to become a very good doctor and a very caring professional. But it's that, sort of, she did it because she knew what it was like to be the new kid. And she said, nobody likes to be the new kid. So I'm going to go sit with them or ask them to sit with us. So it is that simple spirit, asking people to come into your group, asking people to sit with us. But if you are in a workplace, asking sometimes the elephant in the room, and I'll give you a great example, and it is a Gowling's example for many years ago. And we had an all-white male management group. And there's this huge, we want to be more international. We want to do this. We want to do that. Any questions? And everybody who knows me knows that I don't mind asking the first question. Okay. So I'm known for that. Nobody wants, like you have to understand, these are all accomplished partners, top lawyers in their fields on magazine covers, and nobody wants to ask a question in this group. And they all look at me. So I put my hand up, and I still remember, says, we want to do all of this. And how are we going to do this with a bunch of, how do I put this diplomatically? Pale, unilingual men in charge. And everybody laughed, right? But it was an important question. We are no longer all white men. We do have women in significant since then management, but it took someone to ask the question. And I did it deliberately in a humorous way because I knew that would reduce the tension, because it wasn't important. How do we get more women in management? Anybody who's read about law management knows underrepresentation of women in management levels is a huge issue. It's also about, if you are ever involved in a hiring decision, encouraging people to recruit outside your normal circles, in different magazines, in different newspapers, in different languages, reaching out to underserviced groups and welcoming them, if they can, with volunteer opportunities or speaking opportunities, and reaching out to other allies. So you may see, oh, there's this Black students group that is doing really good stuff. Hey, I'm working at Gowling's and we've got a diversity and equity group. Can we help you? That kind of cross-pollination really helps. Looking at your boards, committees, and workplaces, and just calling the elephant in the room. Is it all white? Is it all men? Is it all old people? Is it, I can arm you and we can talk, Rebecca. I mean, the statistics, there's the old saying that, the demographic imperative. The demographic imperative in Canada is that over 50% of our workforce is going to be new immigrants. So if you're not appealing to them, you're going to lose out in talent. And we're seeing the huge labor, the great resignation, the labor shortage. But also, if we exclude people, they're going to not be happy. And that's such a huge waste. I don't want to hear about any more taxi drivers who have PhDs. I don't want to hear about, taxi drivers who are doctors and lawyers. And I want to tell you a story about when I failed to be an ally. And it is one of those little episodes that sticks in your mind. At my old firm in Toronto, if you worked late, they would give you a cab chit. And so that you didn't have to take the subway or walk home. And I had this very handsome Iranian guy drive me home, and we started talking. He asked me what I did. I said I was a lawyer. He said he had been a lawyer in the old country, which raised the question what his old country was, and he was from Iraq. And he had been a fighter pilot, and I made some glib little comment about, well, it must be hard driving a taxi when he used to fly jet planes. Can you guys hear me, or have I frozen? No, you can hear me. Okay, good. Just want to make sure because, all the tech. And I made some comment about, the taxi and the jet pilots, and he made a comment of saying, no, he was grateful to be able to drive the taxi because all his friends were dead. What I should have said, and I said, we were near my destination, and I said it was nice to meet him, and I wished him a safe night and thanked him. But what I should have done is given him my business card and said, if he'd ever want to be a lawyer in Canada, to come and talk to me, because I knew at least some of the ways he could get back into the legal profession, maybe not as a lawyer, but as a law clerk or a junior. And I didn't do that. And to this day, and it's 25 years later, I remember that conversation and I kick myself because I could have helped him and I missed an opportunity. So, there's opportunities in cab rides and, train rides and casual places to be an ally, to be a potential mentor. But of all the things that you can do as an ally is sometimes people will say horrendous things or do horrendous things, and the people who are being impacted aren't in the room. And so it's essentially, how can you use your power to defend people who aren't even in the room and who will be impacted by decisions that are being made? And that's the important, most important thing I think you can do when you start having power in your own life.
Because, Neena, so authentic about talking about a story about 25 years ago when you didn't do the kind of sponsorship and mentorship you could have done. I know you've done a lot more since. So it's useful to think about the ways that we have not succeeded, but I do want to just support Neena and say that, you've done a ton of good work since.
I think it's human nature to always wonder about we are critical, right? As humans, we always think about our mistakes. So I really do feel for that guy. And I have no doubt that he would have done very well. He was very well spoken, very bright. I'm sure he's done well, but I always wonder, and I always feel I missed an opportunity. So I just thought I should share that. There's always opportunities if you're to be a good mentor, a good sponsor, a good ally, sometimes when you're not expecting it. In my defense, it was 10:30 at night and I was exhausted. So here you go.
Here are some drilling down to a little bit of detail with respect to what can we do in those micro processes, those little tiny moments where we could be supportive or not, where we could be allies or not. So for example, if somebody says this is the best country in the world, I don't know why various people from various places are always complaining. Consider your own family's immigration status and journey, and how they focused on improving their lives. My family came to Canada from a variety of places in Europe longer ago, but they came out of desperation. They came at, the story isn't that different. It's just an older story. And so I think it's important to have some level of introspection about ourselves there. Or sometimes people say, well, she's just a token hire. It's important to note the advantage, the privilege, the relative advantage that people have had with respect to historically, the ways in which it has been, although Neena's been very fair talking about how white people and white men in particular have been able to have vulnerabilities as well, and a lack of privilege in certain ways. It is also, if you knew your cousin at the golf club, for example, or at church, for example, the ways in which people have been unfairly advantaged by being part of majority race or majority communities. So it's important, and you could say back, it couldn't have been easy for her, good for her for making it in this business. If somebody says homosexuals are sinful, I mean, you could engage with someone in their own religious context if that's appropriate. All of us are sinners, and you can use a little levity. Transgendered individuals are confused. If somebody says that, they say, I think they just want to live their lives. Don't you want to just live your life? And so there's lots of different techniques we can use. They don't all have to be particularly combative. We can use humor, as Neena said in her example. We can use humor. We can be friendly. It sort of depends on the context. We don't have to be overtly hostile, loud, or public, although we could be depending on when, right? The lawyer answer, of course, the classic lawyer answer is it depends. But we don't always have to start there. We can remain collegial, friendly, and have that call-in culture with people until such a time that, we've reached that threshold, we've reached a boundary. But we might not want to start there. I'll switch the slide.
So I've put some of these examples together because I've actually heard them, right? So I have a little collection, and so, all blank or blank. And I think I've told you the story of, being a kid and hearing some of my parents' South Asian colleagues makes them very difficult. And I think it is appropriate when you hear something like to say, well, you don't like it when people make assumptions because, and it could be age or gender or race, and just say it's safer to treat people as an individual. Try to create that commonality. I just finished doing some training on mental health first aid. And, one of the training exercises dealing with somebody who is having a really hard time, like a psychotic break. And they actually say, don't challenge them, like actually make them feel like you are supporting them. Try to use their reality to help them figure out what the right solution is. So if their reality is they hate having people making assumptions because, I don't know, because he's old, because he came from a different country, speaks with an accent, then it's a very good way of saying, hey, you don't like it when people make assumptions about you. I think it's safer to treat him or her as an individual. The other one is interesting, and is what do you mean I have to use they, them, and their for their pronouns? There's only one of them. They, them, and their are singular. And I think that instead of arguing the grammatical point, I think I just say, look, it's hard for me too. I grew up where they, them, and their were always used for plural. It gets easier. It's just a sign of respect. Give it a try. It's a lot easier. Don't worry about making mistakes. I think sometimes it's really about, I don't want to be and be embarrassed by using the wrong pronouns and then having somebody jump on me. So if you reassure them, look, just try or correct yourself, you'll be fine. I mean, there's some people who are not going to do it. I know a couple of people who refuse to use it in a way that is intended to be aggressive. You're not going to be able to use a gentle technique. If somebody's going to be that stubborn, you might want to remember that a business was fined $30,000 by the Alberta Human Rights Commission for refusing to use the correct pronouns. I don't know about you, but even at my income level, a $30,000 fine would remind me to use the right pronouns. So, but I always start with the least confrontational way of doing things and then move and scale it up, because I think that is an easier way, because then people don't think that you're fighting them, but trying to help them.
Yeah, I completely agree. I just wanted to follow up. One way, think about it is to assume the best of people until they prove you wrong, right? So give them a chance to notice they're wrong. Give them a chance to do, right? Okay.
This is what yeah.
If somebody says immigrants are taking all the jobs, well, why do you think that? To challenge those assumptions. And as Neena said, with respect to somebody who's maybe having a psychotic break, go into their reality a little bit and try and engage with them. One of the things that social media has done to us, and very polarized conversations have done to us, is we are not having civil conversations about difficult things as often as we ideally would. Sometimes, you have to choose, right? You have to choose your own kind of emotional safety, and you have to like work with your boundaries. But maybe it's a good idea to try, give this person an opportunity to grow. They might, engage in that conversation. They are to have some hope that they might do better.
Right. And you don't, and sometimes I think we want instant results. That's the other thing about our technology, right? Like you press a video or you'll download something on Spotify and it's instantaneous. And change is not instantaneous. And sometimes you can have a conversation, you feel like, well, that went nowhere. And yet maybe a month later or 2 months later, you have a conversation with that same person and you realize, oh, well, that tone of that conversation changed a little bit. And whenever I hear the immigrants are taking all the jobs, it often comes from a fear. There's economic change. There are people who've lost their jobs or feeling vulnerable in their jobs. And this is why I often say, class is something we don't talk about. There's often more in common with the people who are saying immigrants are taking all the jobs and the immigrants who are working from a class perspective. But of course, because they see each other from a race and immigration perspective, they don't actually consider the commonality of class. So I sound positively Marxist at this point, which probably sounds very bizarre for a lawyer in a major law firm, but there is something about a Marxist analysis about how powerful groups have used divide and conquer as a way of keeping groups that should be natural allies from being allied with each other. So be respectful when you're having those conversations, but just plant a seed, move it forward, and see where the conversation takes you next week or the week thereafter.
Right, absolutely. And another assumption about Indigenous people, not wanting to get educated. We've seen this year with the revelation of the bodies that were found at the Indigenous residential schools, why Indigenous people might have some resistance to Western systems of education, the intergenerational trauma we're talking about. So, a question could be, did you see the news about that? Did you hear about that? Did you notice what happened on Canada Day? That and as Neena said, it can be about planting seeds. A person doesn't have to have their whole mind changed in a day. You might want to encourage them to look at something, consider other sources. We talked at the beginning about, reading different books, right? That can be tremendously helpful to helping people understand different situations and develop empathy. And there is something called the contact hypothesis, which you may have heard of, but the idea that if you spend more time with other people, you'll learn more about them. I had the opportunity to watch To Kill a Mockingbird as a play last week. And there's a famous quote by Atticus Finch, who's sort of the archetypical American lawyer in Harper Lee's novel. There's another book recommendation, To Kill a Mockingbird. He said, you want to walk around in another person's skin for a while to get a sense of what's motivating them, to develop that empathy. Okay, next slide. Neena, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll take these. These, like, I've heard all of this, right? We tried hiring, insert, group or person, it didn't work. I love that. So if one, and this puts actually a tremendous pressure. We know, like, as a minority hire, I know that if I'm the first minority hire, if I mess up, I may mess it up, not just for me, but for the whole community. So that puts a tremendous pressure. But what's ironic is when a white articling student made a mess, it didn't mean that they wouldn't hire any more white people. It was just that particular articling student made a mistake. And so my response is, hold it there. We've hired lots of white men, white female, graduates from that school that didn't work, and we didn't stop hiring that group. Let's give it another chance. And so the other one I hear, and I heard recently, look, most of our workers from whatever community, and I don't think they're going to want to work from somebody from another community. It's, it's too different. And I think I appeal to their economic interest, which is, look, we can't be really choosy. We're in a labor crunch. We need to expand our horizons. Let's give it a shot. And I will say, that we might have to work a little bit about making sure that they feel comfortable with each other. I've heard this right to my face. I don't want to hire a young woman. They're just going to get pregnant and go away. Now, what's really interesting to me is we did a study at this time about women and men going away. Men would leave too, to take a different job, to take reservist leave because they were going off to support the military reserves, to take a sabbatical, to go back and do a master's. And all of these things were considered to be great things. Like, this is a good manly thing to do. But we still didn't have that associate for a particular, 12 months, 6 months, whatever. But if a woman took that time to have a baby, that was a terrible thing. And so one of the things that I would use is to say, look, we're going to lose a certain amount of our cohort, or, because they're going to want to do certain things. And, we lost so-and-so because they wanted to go to the military. We lost so-and-so because they wanted to go travel. We have no guarantees. I don't want to lose that on a great hire just because, you think they might make a decision in the future to have a family. We will figure it out. Not saying that I'm always successful. I will say that those conversations do not occur at Gowling's, at least not to my knowledge. But I have heard I don't want to hire a young woman from a number of my clients, and I persuade them differently. So there you go. I also point out that it's contrary to law in the Human Rights Code. But as you can tell, I prefer, I prefer persuasion over force, right?
I completely support that. So in terms of, as we've been saying, as Neena said, there's a journey. So here's kind of a process map of some of that journey in terms of allyship. So we could start by trying to do no harm. We don't want to contribute to the conversation in a negative way. So knowing what microaggressions are, listening, trying to learn, and, as Neena said, analogizing it to working out, train our minds, train ourselves, try and stay up to date. Libraries are good for that. Give her full attention, don't interrupt, and try to start by even a silence on our part, listening, declining to laugh at an inappropriate joke. That is in itself an action. Inaction is a type of action, right? If you want to get philosophical about it. And so start by not participating, not actively participating. And then advocate for underrepresented groups in small ways. Not everything has to be dramatic. As I said, most of us are never going to have a chance to sit on a jury trial where Derek Chauvin gets convicted. I mean, obviously that's an American example, but most of us are not going to have a dramatic single moment where something anti-racist that we get to do is, publicly lauded. Rather, we're going to have many tiny opportunities. So we can intervene and assist. We can invite people to speak. We can refer our clients to them. We can encourage them. And we can also change someone's life significantly. So we can intervene in small ways, we can intervene in large ways, we can mentor and sponsor. We can volunteer in the community, and we can transform our team and company, which is what we are working on doing in our law firm. That is my day job that we are trying to do at Gowling WLG in terms of working together to genuinely transform our workplace culture as well as our community culture.
And we are working hard on it. Listen, we've only touched the surface of allyship. And I wanted to give, as I said, both Rebecca and I love libraries. I have always thought that if I had to be marooned somewhere, I would want to be marooned with a library. So there you go. But we've put together a little bit of a bibliography of some of the resources we found very useful in our allyship journey. And some of these are available online. Others will be available through the Vaughan Public Libraries or through interlibrary loans. Some of them are articles from great resources. If you could just stop here, I mentioned, and I really wanted to give credit to LinkedIn for putting out their unconscious bias, 101 course for free. At least when I took it, it was for free and was absolutely excellent. So if those of you are looking for a beginner resource, that is a great free or low cost beginner resource. And then next, I think is there another slide here? Yes, we're down to, I know probably not, one of the things that our firm has done informally, and it's just been probably my favorite part of the EDI journey, is we have an EDI book club. So you know how libraries facilitate all sorts of book clubs. There are some great books that are out there, and we have great discussions, and we don't always agree, but they are always thoughtful discussions. So if that's something you're looking to, if you're thinking of something that is actually enjoyable, social, and will help you in your allyship journey, I encourage you thinking about a EDI book club. I don't know if we got any questions. I was sort of monitoring it, but not really. So do we have any questions, Alicia?
Well, let's see. Let's see what we have here. So there are some comments. I support your point, Neena. I believe calling grows people more than call out.
Well, yeah.
Yes, and here's a question. Does Neena agree with the word equality? I hear equity a lot, and I guess I just want to clarify what we mean with these terms or how we see them.
So I'm actually going to turn that to Rebecca, because there's actually a really interesting discussion in legal communities between what I would consider to be formal equality and equity, and there's quite a bit of a distinction. So Rebecca, if you wanted to perhaps take it, and I'll chime in afterwards.
When we are dealing with equity, diversity, inclusion, we're working in a space that is transnational. So some of the discourse or the discussion around what equity means comes from the United States. And to keep in mind what equality means in the United States, I actually spent some time, I went to school, I did a graduate certificate in women's gender and sexuality studies at the University of Cincinnati in the United States. And if you talk to an American about what they think equality means, you're going to get a different answer. So under Canadian law, Section 15 of the Charter, the jurisprudence under Section 15.2 makes equality into something called substantive equality, which is substantially similar in terms of being equality of result, leveling the playing field, to what is meant in popular parlance by the word equity. So what I'm saying is, if we try and draw that bright line between the terms equity and equality, they're not actually opposites at all. And people who assume equality is a bad word and equity is a good word might be right if you're talking about equality in the sense that most Americans use the word. Most Americans would use the word in terms of a formal sense of equality, in terms of equal opportunity. Canadian lawyers using the word equality actually mean a different thing. So when I say I'm passionate about equality, which I am, I'm talking about substantive equality, which is set out in the jurisprudence under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So I think the debate between equality and equity is misleading to use those words. And I try not to draw a distinction between those two words. And I actually try to think about, what do we really mean, right? What do we really mean? Do we want to have a fight about those terms, or we want to think about what are the things we're trying to do with those terms? And one of those things is really sort of unpack and think about the assumptions about what are we talking about in terms of equality and equity? Because again, as I said, a lot of the writing that you're going to read in equity, diversity, and inclusion space about equality assumes an American lens on the term. So I hope that's some sort of clear. I get a little exercise about that.
I can tell. So, and equality is almost was certainly in older writings. If you're looking at, 18th and 19th and early 20th century writings on a formal equality that really disregarded the reality. I loved your quote. I've heard it but forgotten about it. Is the rich and poor both have the right to sleep under the bridges? Well, that's kind of a meaningless sense of equality. Rebecca, if you don't mind going back to the first page of the resources page. Sure. I think somebody wanted to look at it. We are going to share our slides. So, and this book list, by the way, our book list keeps getting longer and longer. And I noticed that one of our listeners added a book title we are using with our senior team to develop common language and understanding with EDI's Me and White Supremacy by Layla Sayad, I think. And I don't know that book, so we will have to look that up, Rebecca, and read it. And maybe the Vaughan Public Libraries has it, or maybe they should order it so that they can share it. We hope that this presentation has helped a little bit about thinking about how each of us, regardless of where we are in life, can be strong allies in the cause of equity, diversity, and inclusion.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you to Neena and Rebecca for your excellent presentation and all of your tools that you shared. Thank you for your extensive knowledge and insights that you shared with us. So I would just like to pass it on to Mr. Gary Thompson, Vice Chair of the Vaughan Public Library Board, to close and to say a few words. Over to you, Gary.
Very much, Alicia. Good evening again, everyone. My name is Gary Thompson, and I'm Vice Chair of the Vaughan Public Library Board. I must say, this presentation has taken my breath away. Trying to peel myself off the ceiling. It has been a tremendous experience. Not that I did not expect it, because this is indeed the caliber of presentation that we have sought throughout this series. And I can think of no better way to end our series than with a presentation like this being done by two human beings like this. So on behalf of everyone in the audience and all of us at Vaughan Public Library Board, I'd like to thank Neena and Rebecca for this great session. Allyship and solidarity are critical components in building a more equitable society. And the insights provided tonight have provided inspiration and food for thought. And it is through supporting one another, taking a stand and living by our best beliefs that we can make a difference. Let me just say that this is the number 8 of 8 sessions. Our intent at Vaughan Public Libraries has been not to provide a finite experience, but more importantly, to sow the seeds of what we feel should be an ongoing, effervescent experience. This whole subject area, unfortunately, came to prominence because of the wrongs that were done against George Floyd. However, as tragic as it may be, it has served to have us really step back and think about how we treat each other as human beings. How, as children of God, we seek to differ, we seek to divide, we seek to discriminate, we seek to downplay. My hope, my personal hope, is that this series has sown those seeds of conversation. And in the words of a man that I must admit I have mixed feelings about, the more I learn about him, Winston Churchill, this is but, I think it goes like, this is the end of the beginning, but certainly not the end, but the beginning. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. As a note, we will endeavor to have the series available on a distinct link, via a distinct link on the Vaughan Public Library Board website. So in the next couple of weeks, you'll be able to go, click the link and access not all, but the majority of the presentations that we have had. Let me encourage you to share those presentations, to continue the conversation, and to continue to challenge those around us, our neighbors, or our family members, or our friends, and continue to keep, as Jesse Jackson said, keep hope alive. I'd like to thank all the speakers and attendees from past sessions. As I said, this has been a remarkable journey of discovery. We've learned a lot of things and continue to cause harm and division. But there's also so much hope and love there that we all feel optimistic for the future. Thank you to everyone for attending, and I wish you all the best. Thank you, Neena. Thank you, Rebecca. Back to you, Allyship.
Okay, so Gary has given us a nice send-off. And all I will say is thank you very much for that wrap-up. And I would like to once again thank Neena and Rebecca for joining us tonight, and to thank all of you for taking the time to participate in the Reflecting on Racism and Discrimination lecture series, either through attending, sharing, or just receiving communication from the library. So everyone, have a good night and keep well.